One of the greatest queens ever to rule over England was Elizabeth I, and during her time on the throne she would become ruthless and would order the executions of some of her biggest rivals. She would condemn her cousin Mary Queen of Scots, an anointed queen, for plotting against her, and despite hesitating with this, Elizabeth would order the axeman to perform his work inside of Fotheringhay Castle. She was a very intelligent woman and queen, and she would even, up until her final days, condemn her one-time favourite Robert Devereux, but Elizabeth I would also deal with the Spanish Armada, the most feared naval fleet and European force at the time. She was considered Gloriana, and it was a time where her people saw a development in their culture. But as the year 1603 came around, Queen Elizabeth I was a rather sorry state, as she was a shadow of her former powerful self, and she was not the spectacular ruler that she was in the decades before. Elizabeth I had given up. It would not be long before death would come to claim her, but following her death, the burial vault of the final Tudor queen was broken into a number of times, and what the men found was shocking. Join us today as we look at opening the burial vault of Queen Elizabeth I, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. In the early hours of the 24th of March 1603, Elizabeth I died inside of Richmond Palace. This brought a very sad end to the Tudor era, a period of time which would become the most notorious and bloody in English history. Elizabeth did not have any children, and with this a son of the former Scottish monarch Mary Queen of Scots, who Elizabeth executed, was invited to come and rule, and he became known as King James I of England. Elizabeth I had been ill for some time, and she would become rather depressed and down, and she was a very elderly woman by the standards of the Tudor period, and she lived a remarkable age. Her final years were categorised by losses of some of her closest friends and her favourite advisers, and because of this, Elizabeth began to contemplate her demise and death, and she believed as she sentenced Mary Queen of Scots to death, then she would never get into heaven. She was at times very vacant and deep in thought, and during these episodes her ladies-in-waiting were very worried about her. Elizabeth had before in her life suffered, and she had fought strongly against deadly diseases such as smallpox, which left the Queen with a number of scars on her face. But Elizabeth was not willing to fight for her life any more, and she was 69 years old when she died. On her deathbed, the Archbishop of Canterbury told Elizabeth she would go to heaven, and would rule again, and be a queen in the afterlife, and he told her to hold God in her mind when she passed. Elizabeth's throat was swollen, and she became more depressed, but inside of her privy chambers, Elizabeth I died, and she left a number of specific instructions as to what should happen to her remains following her death. Elizabeth ordered that she should not be embalmed and disemboweled, as the thought of this would greatly distress her, and despite telling her servants not to do this on her body, physicians and doctors continued regardless, and they cut open the Queen's body, removed her internal organs, and stuffed her body with herbs and spices to keep off decay. It was a good job that they actually did this, as the Queen's body would then allegedly explode during its transportation to the place of rest, Westminster Abbey, and the gases from her body even splintered Elizabeth's coffin. Elizabeth I was then placed inside of a lead-lined coffin inside of Richmond Palace, and her body was left to lay in state, with mass said around the coffin and burning tapers surrounding her body. But then the time for her final journey to occur would come. The journey to take Elizabeth's body to Westminster Abbey occurred, and her coffin was taken down the River Thames to the Palace of Whitehall, and her coffin was draped in black velvet and was guarded by 6 ladies. When it travelled by the royal barge, it was noted that the oars at every stroke did tears let fall, due to the grief across the English capital, and it was on this part of the journey that the Queen's coffin splintered due to the internal explosion. But on the 28th of April, a month after her death, the remains of Elizabeth I were taken on the procession to Westminster Abbey. It was said that the city of Westminster was surcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in the streets, houseleads and gutters that came to see the obsequies. There was such a general sighing, groaning and weeping as the like had not been seen or known in the memory of man. But the coffin had been decorated with much of the Queen's regalia, and on top of the coffin was an effigy of Elizabeth I, made from wax and wood, and for many who witnessed the procession, this was actually the first time they had actually seen an image of their Queen. The coffin was on a carriage pulled by 4 horses, and when it got to Westminster Abbey, it was taken into the church for the funeral. The service was conducted by Dean Andrews, the Dean of Westminster, and the coffin was then carried into the Henry VII Lady Chapel. This was hoped to have been a site which would be a Tudor mausoleum when it was commissioned, but less than a century had passed since Henry VII's death, in which the Tudor dynasty was now over. But Elizabeth I was buried initially in the same burial vault as her grandfather and grandmother, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and this was done to signal her role in the Tudor story, as she was said to have been incredibly important. But in 1607 her successor James I would move Elizabeth's coffin and would disturb her burial vault to have her placed in the same vault as her Catholic half-sister Mary I. Elizabeth would be placed directly above Mary, symbolising her importance even in death over her half-sister and rival Bloody Mary. But it was said that 46 shillings and 4 pence was paid for the removal of the Queen's body to her new resting place, but this new place of burial was fitted with a huge tomb that cost King James I around £1,500, which was a huge sum of money during the early 17th century. The tomb shows Elizabeth in her final years, and she is interestingly buried opposite her other rival, Mary Queen of Scots, the very monarch who she sentenced to death. In 1880 a book was published by Arthur Stanley, the Dean of the Abbey, and he had been given special permission and access by Queen Victoria to access the royal vaults and the burials of the kings and queens. He was looking specifically for the coffin of King James I, Elizabeth's successor, and he would break into the vaults and document what he saw, and these are the best descriptions we have of the coffins of the monarchs who ruled centuries ago. Stanley explored an aisle underground in the eastern end of the tomb of Elizabeth I and her monument, and he found a small opening in the walls. When he crept through, he saw a narrow burial vault with 2 coffins inside, and these were Elizabeth I and Mary I's coffins. Stanley went in for a closer look, and he then described the state of Elizabeth's coffin. He said, "The excavations, however, had almost laid bare the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view was obtained into a low, narrow vault immediately beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins, and the 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary. The upper one, larger and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except that the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides and had drawn away because of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on the fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was a Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in the outline of the middle of the cover, on each side the august initials E.R., and below the memorable date 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with narrow moulded panelling. The coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid containing the inscription and panelling was of fine oak, half an inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered with red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak cover, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasps of the 2 Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne, and grave sleeping in the hope of resurrection, the solemn majesty of the great Queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive from the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and of the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted spaces which had been hitherto explored in the other parts of the chapel. The vault was immediately closed. This, it's believed, was the final recorded time that anyone had witnessed the coffin of Elizabeth I, and had written about what they saw and what state it was in. This is the truest account we have of her burial vault today. It is likely, though, that members of staff inside the abbey and religious figures who had been granted access to the burial vault may have peered inside the burial vault of the final Tudor Queen. Elizabeth I still today lies above her half-sister, with the coffin placed on top, underneath the large tomb of her. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.